Nigel Farage has never looked less comfortable than when he's defending the £5 million gift he accepted from the crypto billionaire Christopher Harborn.
You haven't spent any of it?
It's none of your business. It's literally none of your... How much of your salary do you spend on beer, on petrol? It's none of your business.
I think it is the public's business to know...
No, it's not the public's business.
Well, it's being investigated by the Parliamentary Standards Committee, so it's somebody's business. You're saying you need security, a legitimate point. Yeah. How much of that money have you spent on security so far?
I'm sorry. I know I'm not going to answer that deliberately, willfully.
Obviously, instead of answering those questions, Nigel Farage called that stupid by-election, which he's now won, but the parliamentary investigation has now resumed. That is probably going to focus on the timing of his £5 million gift, sorry, not 5 billion, £5 million gift from Christopher Harborn. And the issue is whether or not he could be considered a public or private individual when he received the money. So it was a bit before the election. If he was a politician at the point he received the money, he should have declared it. If he was a private citizen, he can say he didn't need to declare it. That will be what most of the debate entails. However, from my perspective, the details about the donation in the first place are the more interesting elements of this story, and specifically who Christopher Harborn is, why he backed Farage. Right? This, to me, is where sort of the potential corruption, the interests come in. The investigative outlet D-Smog has a new report on Harborn. His crypto company Tether, or a crypto company he sort of part owns, Tether, and the links between Tether, Reform, and the Trump White House. The article was written by Sam Bright and Ollie Haynes, both previous contributors to this show. I caught up with Sam earlier today, and I started by asking him to talk about the company at the centre of this political and financial network. That's Tether.
Basically, it issues a crypto coin, a stable coin, as it calls it, called USDT. And why it's different from other crypto firms is that it backs its cryptocurrency with dollars and other assets, which is why it's called a stable coin. Whereas like the accusation is that Bitcoin is like based on air, as is a lot of other cryptocurrencies. Tether, hence the name, is actually tethered to the US dollar, which in theory makes it less volatile. But the company itself and the currency, it's huge. It's the biggest stablecoin provider in the world. So it's an absolute colossus in this industry. And until a few years ago, certainly in the UK, hadn't really been talked about.
Members of the audience might be thinking, well, it's a colossal of the stablecoin industry, but what the hell is the stablecoin industry? Now, from before reading your article, I hadn't realised quite how big a deal Tether is. So you're saying it's at the moment looking to secure an injection of private capital that would give it a valuation of $500 billion, which make it one of the biggest companies in the world. And you say that given Harborn owns 13% of Tether, so Christopher Harborn, if it reaches this valuation, Harborn would become the world's 30th richest man. And I think so when we hear about, Farage getting donations from this Thai-based crypto billionaire, you kind of just think of him as sort of, just any old rich guy, a bit like Aaron Banks or something. But this is someone who is a really, really big deal when it comes to global finance.
Yeah, he's a super, super rich guy. I mean, to put it into a bit of context, if Tether was valued at 500 billion, it would be in the same realms of like OpenAI and the AI giants that are achieving ludicrous valuations, to be honest. So yeah, Harborn, he doesn't have an executive role in Tether, so he doesn't sort of make any decisions there. He's just sort of a passive shareholder. He's held on to like 13% of the company, which could balloon astronomically if it achieves this, this injection of capital, which would allow him sort of unlimited resources to pile into Reform, to buy British democracy potentially. So yeah, you can trace his source of money and therefore his power politically very directly back to this firm, and his fairly sort of passive interest in it.
Harborn's given more than £25 million to Reform. As you're sort of pointing out, if he becomes the world's 30th richest man, he's going to be able to afford a lot more than that. But what's his official explanation for why he's given that money? Does he just say, I'm a very rich guy who happens to believe in independence from the European Union and less migration to Britain. Is that the argument?
Yeah, he's a really funny one, as most of these billionaire donors are actually. When you sort of study them, the reasons that they give for donating, or a lot of the personal philosophies that they hold are quite incongruous to why he's donating to reform. So I'll give you an example of that actually, Michael. So he owns a wellness retreat in Thailand, in Koh Samui, that's just like this woke retreat where people can go do yoga and meditation, and there's like no alcohol and no phones allowed by the pool. It's the sort of thing that would be flayed by the Telegraph on its front page if it was someone else who was owning it. But his stated reason above all else for giving to Farage is Brexit, is to get Brexit done properly, whatever that means. You imagine it would mean closer to a no deal scenario. Should we cast our minds back a few years to what that looked like? So, complete separation from the European Union and pulling us closer to Trump's America. And what Harbon is essentially is a Thatcherite. He credits, his not just his political ideologies, but his personal decisions to Margaret Thatcher. So he decided to go and study engineering at Cambridge because of Thatcher, because he saw Thatcher speak in Westminster. Harbon attended the uber posh Westminster School just around the corner. And he says that we need to go back to the 1980s. Farage, as we know, despite all of his man of the people chat, is a Thatcherite. That's the reason. It comes back to raw neoliberal economics as it often does.
And what your article is really pointing out is how Tether, so the world's biggest stablecoin company, potentially worth $500 billion, is at the middle of a network of right-wing politics on both sides of the Atlantic. And, we've just discussed the connection to Farage. When it comes to the United States, the connection is via Howard Lutnick, who is Trump's Commerce Secretary. So could you talk about the relationship between Howard Lutnick and Tether?
Yeah, so it goes back a few years. So back in 2021, Tether was in a spot of bother. I won't go into the details, but it had been fined $60 million, Tether and its various associate companies. And basically bankers didn't really want anything to do with it. Apart from Howard Lutnick's firm, Cantor Fitzgerald, that rode to the rescue and said, we'll do business with you. We'll help you to build up those assets, those dollars that underpin the success and the valuation of Tether. And in the process, Cantor Fitzgerald, which was owned by Lutnick, took a 5% stake in Tether. In the subsequent years, Tether's valuation, its profits have boomed. In 2024, its profits were 1.5 times that of McDonald's. It's been called the most profitable company in history by employee. And that means that Cantor Fitzgerald's stake in the firm has ballooned accordingly, and it's worth up to 25 billion quid now. Lutnick himself had to divest his shares in Cantor Fitzgerald when he joined the White House, but those shares in the company were passed to his children. And in the sort of melee of that takeover, Tether happened to provide a loan to Lutnick's children. And we don't know if that helped them to buy the shares, but it happened at the same time. So make your own minds up. And the final piece of this jigsaw is that while Lutnick was overseeing the transition team and while he's been in the White House, they've drafted obviously heavily pro-crypto legislation that Bloomberg's reported, Lutnick had a hand in and would directly benefit Tether and therefore the financial interests of both Lutnick's children and Nigel Farage's biggest donor.
Tether and crypto in general is a very politically exposed industry, isn't it? So, lots of people would accuse it of saying it's basically allowing money laundering because it's an unregulated realm of the financial sector and it allows for anonymity. And obviously the share prices of, this is a private company, but the value of these companies would tumble if there were to be strict political regulation. And there have been lots of calls for political regulation because why are we allowing these companies that facilitate drug dealing and money laundering to operate freely. So it is very important for the future of Tether's profitability that they have allies in, well, particularly the White House. Obviously, that's the best ally to have, but also it wouldn't be any harm to have an ally in Downing Street as well if Nigel Farage were to win a general election. So I suppose, talk to me about this from Tether's perspective. Are they buying up politicians on both sides of the Atlantic? They've sort of perhaps opportunistically allied with right-wing populism because they see this as a way where they can prevent regulation coming forward, which would threaten their business model.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll talk more generally about the industry, I think, for the sake of not getting sued. But I think the industry as a whole, it's facing a political battle at this moment, where you've got governments across the world considering how to regulate the industry, as you say. Like, do they keep it on a tight leash? Do they allow it free reign? Like, this is all up for grabs, basically, this massive industry that seems to have ballooned overnight. And yes, what essentially the industry has done, particularly in the US, is to pile millions and millions of quid into particularly right-wing politicians because they're in favour of deregulation, in order to bring about that world, in order to essentially conduct their business as they please. I mean, it's deeply ironic, actually, that Donald Trump called cryptocurrencies, I think he called Bitcoin a con just a few years ago. And last year, he made over £1 billion from his various dodgy crypto schemes. And he's, probably the most pro-crypto politician in the world at this minute, closely followed by Nigel Farage. So they've seen that they can get a huge return on their investment by piling as much money as possible into politics. And I think it's just representative of the fact that all corporate donations are corrupting to our political process. And in my personal view, they should be outlawed. You've got essentially a guy, and let's face it, 25 million quid is an awful lot of money. Maybe not to Nigel Farage, but to most people. But it's a drop in the ocean for someone like Christopher Harborne, who's worth 18 billion quid on paper as it is currently, and that's even without Tether's valuation ballooning. And he devoted that 25 million quid to essentially buy a political party. And I'm not saying Harborne himself has any personal sort of financial, he's making a financial play. But a lot of donors are. A lot of donors are putting relatively small sums of money into our political system and essentially buying the mechanism through which policy can be written. And I think there's no more active industry on that front currently than the crypto industry.
And isn't that, because I know you're saying sort of like this is a lesson about all political donations and how they're corrupting. And obviously, I take your point. I think you're correct. But I do think there is something even more specific about crypto that is perhaps under-discussed. Because if it were the case that sort of, there was a wind farm company donating to the Labour Party or some car manufacturers donating to the Tory Party, fair enough. These are industries that everyone understands. You might have different views about them, but they're part of the real economy. If these are sort of, there are some businesses where you can say they're to some degree part of civil society. Crypto isn't one of them. So I don't think you speak to any voters who think, oh yeah, crypto, that's a useful industry. Like I still haven't really heard an explanation of why crypto is useful other than it allows people to launder money because it allows for anonymity as money is moved across borders. So if you've got this as sort of the key funder as an industry to, the Republican Party in the United States and reform here, there's something new about that, right? Because it's always been the case that businesses have donated to political parties and then hoped for some favors in return. Now that's often been to the detriment of voters. Sometimes it, might have helped grow. Who knows? There's arguments like that made about China, which is to say that sort of sometimes the relationship between politicians and businesses sort of isn't necessarily the most corrosive thing in the world. But when the business in question is socially useless and also socially quite dangerous, it does seem like something we probably should be talking more about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they benefit from that sense of anonymity. I think they try to have it both ways currently, that they donate very heavily to politics, but also they want to remain in the shadows for as long as possible. And I would say, though, I mean, essentially, yeah, I think you're correct in that crypto is an elaborate form of betting. Basically, you put your money in crypto in the hopes that it'll inflate and that you'll get a nice payback in a few years' time. And it's, for many, it's sort of recreational rather than anything productive. But I would also say that since basically 2010, British politics has been funded by the City of London, by hedge funds, by investment bankers. And, do they do anything more productive than crypto traders do? I think it's more known about what hedge funds do than the crypto industry. But in terms of that, you're just hedging your bets on a particular company, a particular stock, versus you hedging your bets on a particular cryptocurrency. I don't think there's a massive difference. And I think that fundamentally the playbook has been sort of written by finance, by the City of London for the past 15 years, and crypto is just following in those footsteps.
Yeah, I suppose that's a good point. So the sort of contrast I'm making is maybe to something which hasn't existed for a very long time, which is sort of when you've got major employers. So maybe you've got trade unions donating to the Labour Party and then major employers donating to the Conservative Party. And you can sort of see how, that, while not ideal, sort of is sort of potentially, you can argue, has some legitimacy. Whereas with crypto, and you're saying with the City of London, neither of those can make that claim. Do you think this could bring down Nigel Farage?
Yeah, I do. And I think this is only the beginning. I think we've only scratched the surface. We've got the parliamentary investigation into Harbon's $5 million gift, which is almost inevitably going to find against Farage, and then we'll have to trot back to Clacton again in a few weeks. And the police are investigating, various donations made to Reform. I think that this will be extremely off-putting to new donors as well, to the party, who see that there's an immense amount of scrutiny, justifiably, and they're not going to want to involve themselves with an organisation that's embroiled in scandal and a whiff of impropriety. And I think fundamentally, as with most politicians, Boris Johnson was very similar in this respect. Once they lose that man of the people aura, once people think you're the same as the rest of them, you're only in it for yourself, I think you're just setting yourself up for failure. And I think that although it'll take a short while for it to break through to the population at large, I think that's inevitably the course that Farage is on.
I mean, I suppose the counter would be that, Donald Trump's relationship to crypto has sort of involved personal enrichment, which is way more out there than Nigel Farage's. I mean, the details about Nigel Farage aren't good, but Donald Trump literally has started his own Trump coins to fleece his supporters. So, this new world of shameless companies that serve no social function and politicians who are only out to serve themselves, it's not necessarily one that has proven itself to be unfit to thrive in the present political moment.
It's true, although let's see what happens at the midterms. I think there's not really been a test of Trump's political standing in the sort of the high corruption era of the second Trump administration. I think, you just look at Trump's poll ratings are at rock bottom. Reform slipped by 10% or more in the polls over the past year. I think that voters obviously you've got that sort of hardcore base who will support them no matter what, and say that, they've earned it, this is just payback for Brexit and all they've done in the world. But I think there's a lot of voters, and you can see this in the polling actually, that a lot of voters, 2024 Conservative voters who are considering reform, they're now going back to the Conservatives because there's just that sense that everything needs to be right for Farage to really produce a groundswell towards him. And I think lots of sort of traditional Tories who consider themselves to behave properly and, have got this sort of ethical base to them, although economically, their ideologies might be questionable. I think that Farage is really off-putting. I think Farage's sort of brazen self-interest and the way in which he's trying to make money from politics, it seems, I think that's quite off-putting to a lot of the sort of home counties Conservatives who might otherwise be considering the party. And I think as a result, he needs those people. He absolutely needs to destroy the Conservative Party in order to win office. And if a lot of those people are sort of in two minds as to whether to back him, I think that I just don't think he's going to get that critical mass needed to take him over the line, especially given that he's not, one of the two dominant parties.